Hey guys, thanks for clicking into the video. In this one we're going to cover how to build and finish a Hellbat helmet concept from the Batman series. I hope you enjoy.
So for the software to help slice the STL file, we use Cura. In terms of the settings we use to help set up the print, we referenced Frankly Build's video on his general print setup for building helmets, which we'll provide a link down below, along with the file for the Hellbat helmet itself. When building supports, we try to use as little as possible, due to the time consumption it took for the print to build. Basically, the only supports we used were for the base of the helmet to provide good stability along with some support around the eyes. It should be noted, however, that the supports around the eyes weren't needed due to the build naturally being supporting around the eyes already. For the print itself, when we originally sliced it on Cura, due to the amount of supports we had, it was taking about 5 or 6 days to print, which was simply way too long. By taking out the majority of the internal supports, which Cura naturally gives you when you slice initially, it decreased the print build time to about 2.5 days.
First off, after printing was the sanding process, which for this was pretty tedious. You can see even from just printing this out already, it looks pretty insane with how much detail is on it, which almost works against you for this part. Unlike the Wolverine cowl we previously did, which consisted of large surface areas which could be sanded down with the electric sander, this Hellbat helmet had tons of intricate smaller details that would have been lost if you tried to go over them with the electric sander. Here I'm using a sanding block, but you can literally just grab a sponge to wrap your sandpaper around, which is more comfortable to hold and also allows you to get into more smaller gaps, which this helmet had a lot of. On top of all that, we wanted to give this helmet as close to a metallic or mechanical look as possible, which required us to get as smooth as possible, so it was just a ton of sanding done by hand. For the sandpaper used, I started with an 80 grit before moving on to a 180, 240 and finishing with a 400 grit, and this is how it came out. We then moved on to primer, and for this, a tip I'd recommend is using a primer that's a pretty distinct different colour from the base material you use to print the helmet with. The reason for this is that you can clearly identify the parts that have been sprayed and also helps you out later on when you're sanding down, so you can tell apart the parts that have been sanded and the parts that haven't. Again, this helmet has a lot of little gaps and hidden areas, so for this I'd actually recommend spraying it down, letting it dry, and then repositioning it to, let's say, on its side, so that you're kind of letting gravity do its work to fill into the gaps. Now, since this helmet has a lot of smaller details, I didn't want to spray too many coats of primer in case it would lose some of those, so I only did about 2 coats of primer in total. Once the primer was fully dried, giving it about 12 hours, I went over it again with sandpaper for a super smooth finish. For this, do not use 60 or 80 grit because it's too rough and it'll just take off too much of the primer. This is where how much work you put in at the start really pays off. For this, I used a 180 grit to smooth it out before going over it once again with the 400 grit. And so this is it, fully primered and sanded down, ready to be painted. For the first coat we put on a black paint, as that made up the majority of the colour. I wouldn't bother doing any masking tape for this part since there's no point, and you'll be doing plenty of that later on. This is also where having a distinct different colour primer comes super handy for being able to clearly see the parts that you have and haven't sprayed. The spray paint I used for this was just a standard hardware store black paint, and even from just the black coat it comes out looking super cool, and if you wanted you could probably get away with doing just this for a standard Hellbat helmet. Now, the reason I say you could definitely just give it a coat of black and leave it at that is because the next part is just a bit of a pain to do, and there's no real other way around it other than just putting in the time, and that would be using masking tape to cover up the parts that you want to keep black, as well as the parts that are going to be a different colour, as we'll be going over this with a metallic colour to give it more detail. And honestly, although it took a long time to do, I was incredibly happy with how it came out, and I was glad I did it in the end. You can see at the start of the clip there, I use a reference picture of the mask to identify the parts that were different colours that the tape will be going onto. Using a sharp stencil can help a lot here, not just for cutting the tape into shapes, but also pressing the tape into the smaller areas. And so this is what the mask looks like after applying all the masking tape that I wanted to coat with a different color. Even at the back here, you can see that I went through the effort of getting that line down, which really paid off in the end for adding that extra little bit of detail. And so for the additional layer of paint, we used a high temperature metallic black spray paint from a generic hardware store, which contains these particles that almost glitter, adding a shine effect. There's definitely other methods to giving it a shinier look, but for a super handy one spray coat, I think this turned out pretty great. So then once it's fully dried, I like to take off the masking tape. I probably give it about an hour after that coat. And this is just so that the tape doesn't seep into the paint below and doesn't peel or anything. The stencil knife is super handy here for managing to get under the tape and just making it easier for you to peel it off. The last thing I wanted to do here was add the red detail to the mask, which at this point I just went over with a standard red acrylic paint and a brush. If you're like me and you don't have steady hands, I'd surround the area again with some masking tape. I wasn't too mad about the finish with the hand brushed acrylic paint, as it does leave behind brush marks and doesn't offer the same even coat as a spray paint would, but at this point I was not about to go over the masking tape again, so I just went with it, and if I was to do it again I'd probably edge more towards the spray paint. I think in order to give this a fully thick red coat, I went over it with about 6-7 times with the acrylic paint before I was satisfied with how it came out. And there you have it, the finished Batman Hellbat helmet. I just threw in a few LED lights to make it look more robotic, but if you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe for more content.